Perfect. Thank you. I know the after lunch slot is always kind of tough, right? Because everybody's got their bellies full now and it's nice and warm in here and you can just lean back and fall asleep. Yeah. So I might be asking you a few questions along the way just to make sure everybody's still awake. So just so you know, those questions might be coming at you. Like McKenna and Dagan said, my name is Micah Most. I'm the Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Educator based out of Buffalo. I serve Johnson County and I end up in Sheridan County quite a bit, Campbell County a little bit there every once in a while as well. So before that, I was a grad student at the University of Nebraska where I studied animal science and physiology. So I've really enjoyed being out in Wyoming. I grew up on a family farm and ranch and I've always enjoyed the livestock management side of things. Grew up primarily around beef cattle, but McKenna and Garrett and a few others around the state, Whit Stewart, our sheep extension specialist, have been getting me onboarded for all things sheep as well, which I understand is a pretty big deal out here in Uinta County. Is that right? Yeah. Great. So we're going to talk today a little bit about managing livestock in extreme temperatures. And the reason I kind of got interested in some of this environmental influence on livestock is because I studied heat stress as a part of my graduate program. Heat stress in Uinta County, not really an issue, but cold stress can be an issue. As we've already experienced several times this year, those temperatures take a plunge. So we're going to talk first about homeostasis and some of those critical temperatures to keep in mind. This will be kind of a laying the foundation, getting us all on the same page as far as what to expect. Then the major emphasis of what I'll be presenting on this afternoon is cold stress. I will touch just a little bit on heat stress because that's something that I know about. And there's an off chance that, if we get a hot summer day, if our annual temperatures keep going up, that might become more of an issue out in this part of the state. Any questions before I jump into any of that? Okay. So now here's my first question for you. What is homeostasis? Does anybody know? Balance. Okay, what else? Sorry? Steady. I like that word. There was something in the back too that I heard. Over here? No? It was her? Oh, okay. Yeah, so here's a kind of a breakdown of the etymology of this word. It literally means standing still or stopping. So steady, I really liked that. Dynamic equilibrium is another term that gets thrown out quite a bit. Thinking dynamic, things are always moving, things are changing, but there's that balance, that equilibrium that is still maintained. And then this is something I put together as kind of a little bit more approachable definition. Stability while adjusting to ever-changing conditions. So our body systems all operate in homeostasis, whether that's the amount of salt in your blood or your body temperature, the amount of water that's present in your blood. Your body is always regulating those different things around a certain set point. And so when there's external forces operating that pull that one direction, then there are functions in your body from a physiological standpoint that pull things back into balance towards this kind of appropriate equilibrium. And I'm going to call that a set point, and I might refer to that at some point in the future. Now, if our body temperature, external forces operate on that and pull that below the set point, we'll start shivering, right? We got to get something going to produce heat in our body, warm us back up internally. And just the same as for the opposite, if we get too hot, we've got to find a way to dissipate some of that heat out of our body. And just a reminder, this is that set point for humans, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. For our cows and our ewes, it's around 101, 102 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if anything starts getting out of whack with that body temperature, and we use body temperature diagnostically for this reason too, right? You take a temperature, and if it's high, there's some fever going on, some disease issue, we know there's an issue in the system from a big picture standpoint. All right, So now getting into some of those external forces that influence body temperature specifically, and the bulk of the cold stress portion that I'm going to talk about is related to body temperature. There's a lot in our environment that tries to disrupt the internal body temperature of our livestock. Air temperature is the most obvious one. Humidity also plays a role. Clear versus cloudy skies, the amount of solar radiation that's actually making contact with the skin or the hide. Wind speed, that's a pretty obvious one too, right? It wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't for the wind. Nobody's ever said that before, right? And availability of shelter. So that's related to wind speed because if those animals can get out of the wind, that improves their ability to maintain their body temperature. And we'll get into some more details around that in just a moment. There's also a lot of non-environmental factors that influence the ability of an animal to maintain its body temperature. Its nutritional status, body condition score, how much fat reserve it has, plane of nutrition, so what forage is available out on the range or what's the components in that ration that's being delivered to that animal. Coat or fleece status, we'll get into that a little bit. Genetic influence. Certain animals are better equipped to thrive in this environment than others. And I think we can all understand that. Developmental stage, we've got some animals that we really have to work to protect, especially our newborns. When they come into the world, they're wet. And they do not have a lot of ability to maintain their core body temperature until they have dried off. And it's really important for them to get some of that nutrition going as well. So they're getting that energy source from the dam. Growing yearlings, gestating or lactating females, these all have additional energy requirements relative to a mature female who's not milking. And so being cognizant of the production status of your animals is also important when those temperatures take a dip and we're thinking, all right, what can we do to manage? Certain groups will receive a higher priority than others. It's also important to know the conditions that you're working with. You can't manage what you don't measure, and this part is always kind of fun for me because I've given this talk in several places around the state now, and it always looks different because each place around the state has different environmental conditions. And so we're going to walk through some weather data for Evanston. This is pulled actually from the airport here in town. So as I'm walking through some of these numbers, I want you to be out there thinking how this is going to be different from where your home operation is. Maybe you're up somewhere that's got a little bit more exposure to the wind that comes through. Maybe you're down in a little bit of a protected valley where even though you're out of the wind, that cold air settles down there a little bit more intensely. So just be thinking through how your particular situation varies from what the airport captures in their data measurement. So this is air temperature. This is the average for Evanston. So down here, late February, March, we're around, 15 degrees as a low, 30, 32 as a high. Is that fairly accurate? Not accurate. Colder? The average is colder, right. So this is an average, and it's got that nice smooth curve. But let's go ahead and look at what the actual air temperatures were. This I pulled from 2023, so I cherry-picked it a little bit because I knew that was a cold year. Is that a little bit more accurate for you? Right here, yeah, like minus 10, minus 20. And this is just air temperature, right? So this is not factoring in any wind chill at all. This is just ambient air temperature. Yeah, so we know that those averages, and Rob talked about this a little bit earlier, when we're talking about averages, that has a tendency to smooth over some of those variations. And they're useful in some instances, but just like this, there's some data points that get lost through that. So actual air temperatures all over the place and well outside those normal ranges, what would be considered normal or average. This is data that I pulled from this winter. And so, yeah, there's been some cold spells even just earlier this month. Got pretty chilly. It was like 6 degrees when I left Buffalo yesterday to make the drive down, and it was about 30 degrees by the time I got to Rollins. So yeah, it's been plenty cold for sure. I don't remember why I was going to highlight those. I guess just that they were cold spells that were well outside those averages. I was going to have everybody guess what they thought the humidity comfort level would be, but I clicked it ahead already. So humidity, discomfort from humidity in Uintah County is generally not a factor. Maybe a few bumps after some summer storms where there's extra moisture in the air, but it doesn't take too long for the wind to blow that right on over to Nebraska, right? It's dry. This is the high desert. So humidity tends to be a little bit more important when we're talking about heat stress, but we will circle back to this in a little while. Here's one, wind speed. Tends to be pretty windy here. This is our average for February, right around 8 miles per hour. This is the 10th percentile mark, and it never really drops below 3 miles an hour at any given point. But this is not, again, showing any specific spikes in wind. This is just the average. So here's wind speed for this winter. Oops. Yeah, plenty windy. Earlier this month, 60 mile per hour gusts at the airport, 70 mile per hour gusts at the airport. Is that consistent with what y'all experienced? Yeah. Yeah. So those cold temperatures and wind speed combine to create some really dangerous conditions for our livestock. And a lot of this you all know intuitively, but we're going to get into how the livestock respond, how they cope with some of this. So this is kind of a complicated graphic, and I'm going to try to reveal it slowly so that you all can stay with me and I don't get ahead of myself. But upper critical temperature is the top level. Once we get above this, air temperature-wise, those animals start having to expend energy to maintain their body temperature. And the lower critical temperature, this is for like a winter hair coat on a cow or a sheep in full fleece, 32 degrees Fahrenheit as the lower critical temperature. They can maintain themselves. Actually, sheep is lower than that. I think it's closer to 18 when they're in full fleece. Below that temperature, they have to start expending energy from their body reserves to maintain their body temperature. So we have this zone of thermal comfort, which is not showing up super great, but it's from here to here. This is the ideal. This is the sweet spot where those animals are just as happy as can be. If we jump up one more, there's a zone of thermoneutrality, and so that's where they are not expending energy, thermoneutral. Heat production here is being depicted on the colder end. Now, if you would imagine, this axis right here is like a thermometer laid on its side. This is towards the colder end. This is towards the hotter end. Once those animals hit this lower critical temperature, they start to shiver. They start to find ways to mobilize energy reserves in their body to increase heat production, but eventually that will hit a point where that can't be sustained. They lose their ability to regulate their internal temperature. And the same goes on the hot end as well. They can sweat, they can pant, and eventually they lose that control. If we jump up one more, this is the zone of homeothermy, and so homeothermy means that they are still able to exert control over their body temperature and maintain that intact. But once we get outside of that zone, they lose that ability to have any control, typically with not a very good outcome. And then the largest zone up here at the top is the zone of survival. This is a range of temperatures that is compatible with life, but outside of this homeothermy zone, right in here, that's outside intervention that has to bring them back in. So that's you maybe wetting them down if they get too hot, or tubing them and delivering some warm liquids to bring their core body temperature back into this zone where they're able to resume regulation and keep themselves alive. We're going to revisit a little bit of this towards the end, but I thought this would probably be a little bit more helpful and relevant to think about. So this is a similar concept as that previous graph. We've got temperature across this axis again, hot on this side, cold on this side. But this time we're looking at feed intake and maintenance energy requirements. So as our cows and our ewes are getting cold, they pass that lower critical temperature, so they're starting to have to burn energy to keep themselves warm. Their feed intake is going to go up because their maintenance energy requirement is also going up. And at a certain point, those animals can only eat so much, right? We talked about rumen capacity with McKenna and Dagan earlier this morning. That's a limited amount of space in the rumen that can be filled at any given point. And so they will max out eventually and not be able to keep up with their energy demands and that energy requirement. Kind of the opposite is true on the hot end of things. One of the first signs that you know an animal's heat stressed is they will go off feed. And their energy requirements do also go up though, because they are panting and they are finding ways physiologically to eliminate heat from their body system. So the big takeaways from this, this is specifically from a cattle group, but it applies just the same to sheep. Cold cattle eat more, warm cattle eat less. And just a note on intake, if protein is limiting, so if they're out on a range diet and they're not able to get at least 7% crude protein out of that diet, that's going to also limit intake. So that's when we might start talking about supplementing protein to improve intake and continue to meet energy requirements. All right, when to expect cold stress. This is pretty intuitive and obvious, but one particularly important one is wet hides. Anytime those animals get wet, their coat, talking about cattle again, their coat collapses and it has no insulating power. So that's the difference in going outside today with a big, thick down coat on versus taking off everything down to a t-shirt and then going out there. That's the difference that water makes on a hide. And typically that's of large concern when it's liquid precipitation coming out of the sky. If it's snow, it does not tend to collapse the insulating capacity of the coat in the same way. Sheep tend to be a little more resilient because their wool is less permeable to liquid precipitation. Body condition is also an important one to keep an eye on. When is the best time to add? When is the most economical time to add body condition? Before it gets cold, right? And also, thinking from a gestation side of things, before those females are trying to grow a baby, before they're lactating for sure, that's really when they tend to be in a negative energy balance anyway, and you cannot economically put body condition on an animal. So fall tends to be a good time around weaning to assess body condition scores and make any nutritional adjustments that need to be made. So your animals, they have instincts, right? They know how to keep themselves warm. Some of this is behavioral, some of it is just automatic. Their nervous system kicks in and they'll start shivering, but they will bunch. They'll spend more time standing, less time laying down. As you can see here, they'll seek out places where there's some shelter out of the wind. And we're going to get into some of the structural relief here in a little bit more detail, but you can see this work has been going on for a long time, trying to figure out what the worst case scenario looks like. And I think they have not spent enough time in Wyoming because this wind speed only goes to 30 miles an hour and the temperature bottoms out at -20, and we tend to have conditions that would expand even beyond this. So I've got a little more expanded chart to look at here in a minute, but let's see. Here we're looking at that data again from this winter, and like this storm that came through and got pretty cold lines up with some of those pretty extreme wind speeds, right? And so we're obviously well into this great danger zone. And at this point in the year, there's probably not a lot of calves and lambs on the ground, but those females that are in gestation have demand on their energy for growing that fetus, for maintaining themselves. If it's a heifer or a yearling ewe, they're also still trying to achieve their mature body size as well. And so there's energy that needs to be allocated towards that as well. I mentioned the wetness being a factor, so we're going to come to this critical temperature and use this in an equation here in a little bit. But you can see just how much a heavy winter coat provides insulation versus a wet coat or a summer coat. This isn't even below freezing, and at 59 degrees, a cow has to start burning energy to keep her body temperature intact if she's wet. For sheep, they tend to be a little bit more resilient, but they are kind of susceptible at a certain period right after shearing, where if there's any kind of storm event coming through, shelter needs to be prioritized. Keep them dry as best you can, at least for the first 5 to 7 days at least, if not a couple weeks, until they get reacclimated and adjust back from being shorn. Okay, so here's what I'm hoping is the most useful part of this presentation for you. A couple management responses. These are things that you can do to help combat the environmental effects on your livestock. The first one is shelter. And this is pretty obvious. We've already talked about wind speed, wind chill, and all of those effects. But windbreaks really are pretty effective. I grew up in Nebraska where there's a lot of shelter belts. And I was curious, what do you all, or what do people in this room use for windbreaks? What does that look like? Is it snow fence? Is it stacked hay? Guardrails? Is that pretty much the case for everybody? No? Stacked hay, wood fences. Yeah, so there's a lot of things that work well for this purpose. And I wondered, I didn't think shelter belts were probably an option out here just because the climate's so tough to grow your shelter belt tree species in. But the general rule of thumb is the sheltered area that will be downwind from that structure is 5 times the height of the structure. So whether that's something set at a right angle or just a straight line fence that you've got put up. So something as short as 8 feet high, 40 feet of shelter in the downwind area. This is that wind chill chart that is expanded and a little bit more useful for us here in this part of the country, where we really do get down into some of this area. And these frostbite type zones are indicated for human health here, but I would say that these are just as applicable to our livestock species. Does anybody collect their own weather data on the ranch? If you're in agriculture, weather is like the best thing to talk about ever, right? Every time you stop in the coffee shop or run into a neighbor at the store, you got to compare who got what precipitation, how cold it was. That data is important, right? It's not just social lubrication and small talk. It's actually really important to inform some of our management decisions. So I know I'm a huge nerd, but I always look at my weather station and make those observations because, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the data that I'm presenting is recorded at airports, but that is not always accurate to where your feet are on the ranch, and there can be a lot of variability because of topography and terrain as well. So if you're not collecting your own weather data, maybe get yourself one of those little notebooks that was out on the table out there, and you could start jotting down just air temperature and wind speed when you wake up in the morning. Start there. And we're going to get into an application of using that. It's also important to know what direction your prevailing wind is coming from. So being in Buffalo, Johnson County, I'm used to a northwest wind, but if we look down here towards the Uintah County, Evanston area, more west, southwest, yeah. And we have a lot of terrain around the state, so wind comes from just about any direction, any given location. But orienting your windbreaks to be perpendicular to your prevailing wind provides the best area of relief for your livestock. So that was the crash course in shelter. I should have mentioned that publication that I cited down here. This is from the University of Nebraska. This is a really, really comprehensive extension bulletin from them, and it goes through all kinds of different windbreak setups and spacings, and I really, really recommend that, and I'd be happy to get you a copy of that if you have questions. The other thing I guess I should note too before we move away from this is you're going to catch snow with your windbreak too, which I know you know. But it's important to, if you're going to be putting up a new windbreak, keep in mind what impacts might be on like the driveway or the yard of your house. Any structure that you put up, even if it's a new shop or new shed, will create a dead space where that snow will settle out and potentially drift in places you don't want it. So this also kind of helps think through some of those decisions as well. Oops. Okay, so feed is the other big tool that we have in combating cold stress in our livestock species. And I pulled this up again. We're going to talk about maintenance energy requirement. So that's what it takes to keep those animals going. That energy demand does increase in the cold, and capacity for intake will become limiting. Any animals in a production state, like gestating or lactating, are going to have an elevated demand. Which one of these feed options do you think would be more appropriate to feed a cold stressed cow? Anybody have any thoughts? Somebody was pointing towards the left, towards the alfalfa. Anybody, any votes for the cake? Well, I'm going to make an argument that there's a place for both. Roughage does generate more heat. So there's a lot of fiber in hay, in alfalfa hay and grass hay. And as that moves through the rumen, that generates heat. And it can be, I think the literature says that's up to like 34% of heat generated in the body comes from the rumen. And so we want to keep those bugs happy when it gets cold out. Another thing that happens when it gets cold is there are enzymes that are in the rumen produced by the microbes. Amylase is one of them, cellulase is another, and those break down those really tough starches. That's why we can't eat grass, because we don't have that cellulase enzyme that breaks down cellulose. The function of those enzymes decreases under cold weather. So that's where feeding those microbes some protein through cake or distiller's grains or whatever your protein supplement might be, if you keep those microbes happy, keep that protein level up, you keep your intake up, and that improves digestibility of your roughage feeds as well. And I was looking last night to see if I could find any evidence that feeding in late afternoon actually increases body temperature overnight. I was not able to find anything that implied that, but we do know that feeding, rumination peaks about 6 hours after feeding. And so rumination, breaking down those feed stuffs, releasing heat, I think we can kind of get there. We can imply that if we're feeding in late afternoon, that's going to line up peak rumination and heat generation in the rumen with the coldest overnight temperatures. There is also work that has demonstrated that feeding in late afternoon improves the number of cows calving during daylight hours. And that's also, interestingly, all tied back to body temperature. They will tend to calve after peak rumination when that body temperature drops. And so if you're feeding for that reason in the afternoon or evening, then you're also potentially helping insulate those animals against cold stress in the overnight hours. So I didn't expect to find that, but I thought that was kind of an interesting takeaway. So we know that energy demand increases in the cold, and this is like the biggest thing that I want you to take away from my talk this afternoon. We're gonna work through some steps to adjust a ration during cold weather to accommodate for the increased energy requirement. So first, we're gonna use the lower critical temperature. Remember that chart that I threw up there that had the different hair conditions? We're gonna use that lower critical temperature from that table, and then the wind chill index to find a magnitude of cold. And this number is kind of just an index. It doesn't really have a whole lot of true meaning for us other than this is how cold this animal is experiencing the current conditions. Then from there, we're going to increase energy 1% for every magnitude of cold. So we're finding that magnitude of cold in step one. We're gonna that's a 1-to-1 conversion, 1% right there. And then in step three, we're gonna use our hay test results to convert from percent TDN to the number of pounds that need to be added per animal. This is on a per head basis. We're gonna work through an example of this. Slow me down if I'm moving too fast, because I know it's after lunch and we're gonna talk about math. So here's a refresher. These are the critical temperature tables. We're gonna be working through an example with beef cattle. So this is the one we're gonna be looking at. And then here's our wind chill chart again. So we're gonna use the ambient temperature and the wind speed to find the effective temperature and use that in our step one of the equation. Okay, here's the problem. We're gonna use a winter coat. We're gonna assume a temperature of 20 degrees Fahrenheit and a wind speed of 10 miles per hour, 1,200 pound cow. So, first thing, magnitude of cold. What is the lower critical temperature for a cow with a winter coat? 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Yep. What about, what's our wind chill index at 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 miles per hour? 9? Okay, 32 minus 9. It's not super complicated math, not too bad, right? 23. So our magnitude of cold in this case with these assumptions is 23. So now step two, we're gonna adjust 1-to-1, 1% for every magnitude of cold. 23% is how much we need to increase the energy in the diet. So for a 1,200 pound cow, her TDN requirement under average conditions is 11 pounds per head per day. So we're gonna increase that by 23%. So 11 times 1.23, 123%. Now to meet her requirement, she needs at least 13.53 pounds per head per day per TDN. Do you know off the top of your head, TDN, if you don't have your hay tested, you're just kind of guessing? So this is my opportunity to plug this, put together by my colleague Dagan. He did this really nice little trifold, hay testing and interpreting your hay test for beef cattle. There's a whole stack of them on the extension table out there by the registration booth, and I would recommend picking one of these up because it is really important to get your hay tested. If you call your extension office and ask them to help you work through this kind of scenario, they're gonna ask you, what did your hay test say? Because without those numbers, it's just a shot in the dark trying to figure it out. You can't manage what you don't measure, right? So we gotta measure it first, then we'll manage. So if we know from our hay test that our hay is coming in at 56% TDN on a dry matter basis, then we'll take that into 13.53, which is our requirement, 24.2 pounds per head per day on a dry matter basis. So that's what we need to be feeding now. And just to really follow through with this whole exercise, I calculated what it was for normal conditions. So I took 11 divided by 0.56. Normally we would need to be feeding 19.6 pounds per head to meet that requirement. But under these environmental conditions, now we're gonna need to bump about 5 more pounds of hay for each animal that's out there. So this is This is an action that you can take. This is a real thing that you can do to help get your animals through that period of cold stress, however long that may last. And that's why it's also important to know what the temperature and the wind speed are, and be able to make those accommodations. I will add that animals that have been in the environment for a long time are acclimatized. They're kind of situated to be able to take something like a winter storm like we experience better than a load of cows that you brought in from Oklahoma or Texas or wherever that maybe are not used to these environmental conditions. And so they would be bringing in animals from another climate that are not adjusted to this area would be ones that you would want to supplement even a little more than that. Animals that are suited to their environment are easier to manage. This is going to be my point about matching genetics to the place that you are operating. I always feel so bad for them when I see this picture. These Bos Indicus cows they've never seen snow. They're not built for that. This is a little more like it. But animals that are here thinking about home-raised heifers that have grown up in this environment, they've handled it all their life, they're going to be way more prepared to deal with it than something that came in from South Texas or wherever. And sheep, especially our fine wool breeds, are generally going to be more resilient to cold stress than cattle anyway, keeping in mind the other considerations that we've talked about. Snow on backs is a good thing. That means that there's enough insulation on those animals that they're staying warm and there's no body heat escaping out to melt the snow. So if you're visiting with your new to town, neighbor, somebody that you run into, and they're saying, "Oh, I just feel so bad driving down the interstate. I just feel so bad for those cows out there on the range," or that I saw on this place just off the road covered in snow. If they're covered in snow, they are doing just fine. Their body is working for them the way it's supposed to, and they're in a correct nutritional plane where you don't need to worry about them. If you drove by and it was snowing hard like it is today, it still is, and they were completely soaked through, wet, those are the ones you would need to worry about, not the ones covered in snow. This can also be a way to spot any in your own herd that might be a little bit lacking in their body condition. If you drive out there on a snowy day and you spot a few that don't have snow on their backs, you might jot those ear tag numbers down. I'm not going to spend time talking about calving and lambing or a whole lot of time about managing bulls, but getting them dry right away, obviously, you all know that, and out of the weather is the best thing. If we've had a pretty intense cold snap and your bulls aren't bedded down, make sure you're doing a breeding soundness exam before spring comes around and you kick them out, because there's obvious complications there. Okay, that was cold stress. Fast and furious. Does anybody have any questions before I move into the next short section? I'm going to get a drink of water while you think about it. Anybody got anything? Yes, sir.
So maybe if our cows aren't in the condition they quite should be going into calving, what could we expect as far as maybe rebreed rates next year? Any thoughts on some of that?
Yeah, so the question was cows that are not probably in optimal condition going into calving and what to expect for rebreeding. There is a window right there after calving when you can try to push the groceries to them and get them shaped up good. It's really hard. It's going to take something that's got quite a bit of protein and energy to get them up to a body condition that would be optimal. It's tough also because you're trying to maintain a 365-day calving interval to keep everybody on schedule. You've got really about 60 days to get her rebred and maintain that cycle. It's 80 days total, but she's not cycling for the duration of those 80 days. So you've got about 60 if you're in good shape. If she's not in good shape coming into calving, you probably have closer to 40 days or less. And it's tough. So supplements and working with a nutritionist, calling your extension educator and having them walk through what you're feeding, what resources you have available, and putting together a plan that way would probably be my recommendation. It's going to vary a lot based on what access you have to different feedstuffs. Does that answer your question? Okay. Other questions? Okay, we'll keep things moving. I wanted to touch on heat stress just a little bit because that's the work that I did in my master's. We expect that when the nights are not cooling off, when there's high daytime humidity, clear skies, no breeze, unseasonably warm temperatures. And especially animals in confinement, so anything that's being backgrounded, anything that's on feed, hot and heavy, those animals especially are susceptible to heat stress. How many of these items on this list apply to Uintah County? Maybe one, maybe two, not very many. As we mentioned, temperature jumps around a little bit. This is 2023, I guess, but the way I read this, it's like maybe the highest temperatures in July are hitting 90 as a max temperature. And we talked about how the humidity is not an issue. So even at the max summertime temperature, 90 degrees, it's got to be 35% relative humidity before we start getting into any area of concern. So not a huge issue for this part of the state. I've given this other parts of the state, given this talk other parts of the state where it is a concern, where there's a lot more cattle and lambs on feed, and that humidity can get a little bit higher and creep up. But out here, this is what I'm going to tell you about heat stress. Animals that are a good fit for their environment are going to thrive. And especially if you have grazing allotments on the forest, it's not going to be an issue because it's not near as hot up there. These are my main takeaway messages for you here today. When it gets cold, keep them fed, get them out of the wind, keep them dry as best you can. When it gets hot, if you can keep them hydrated and work during the coolest hours of the day, that one does apply just broadly from an animal welfare standpoint. There are physical, nutritional, and genetic strategies available to you when you're making your management decisions. University of Wyoming Extension is here to help you walk through all of those decisions. And I'm going to end on this slide here. I'm coming to you from Johnson County, where we had a lot of impact to our agricultural community with the fires last year, and also in Sheridan County and Campbell County and other places around the state. This Ag Stress Helpline is the number that's listed up on the top. There are professionals available that know agriculture, they come from agriculture, they speak the language, that are available to help you talk through anything if you're struggling, or if someone in your life is struggling and you're not sure how to support them through it. This helpline is available. And then I also put 988 up here. This is the crisis intervention line. So if you or someone you know is in a crisis of mental health, use these resources. They exist for a reason. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. This is my contact information down here. Other questions? It's cold in Uintah County. Yeah?
Any thoughts on shade in the feedlot?
Shade in a feedlot context. Shade is a very good thing in a feedlot. Shade is, I would say, arguably better than any kind of water drip system or sprinklers you would put on, especially in places that feed a lot of cattle and tend to have a little bit more high relative humidity. you can inadvertently make that local humidity so high that those animals can't sweat, and eliminate any heat from panting or sweating that way. So shade is definitely a good thing. Yeah. Thanks for your attention, everybody. Appreciate it.